Now, let me introduce to you our second keynote speaker, Professor Rachel Armstrong. Rachel Armstrong is Professor of Experimental Architecture at the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape in Newcastle University. Her work explores how our buildings can incorporate some of the properties of living systems to become living architectures, a term that I'm sure we will be discussing at large over the next 24 probably years, not just hours. Rachel Armstrong was the coordinator of an FET Open Living Architecture project, which ran from April 2016 and until June 2019. She coordinates the EU Innovation Fund Alice project. Rachel is a Rising Waters 2 Fellow with the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, April to May 2016, and a 2010 Senior TED Fellow. She's also a member of the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment at Newcastle University, and director and founder of the Experimental Architecture Group, eCAADe, whose work has been published and exhibited internationally. She's also known for her books, Experimental Architecture, Origami, Soft Living Architectures, and Invisible Ecologies, and of course, many articles and book chapters, as you may know. Now I'm giving the stage to Professor Rachel Armstrong. Thank you very much for taking the time for joining the 38th eCAADe, and we are now opening the stage for you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everybody for holding on to this. It's really great to be part of this conference, and I appreciate you giving up your lunch break. I'm going to be talking about analog computing in the 21st century. So if we can have the first slide, please. Computer-aided design is a particular kind of computing. It's mathematical, therefore abstract, binary, cleaves matter from information, and is built on a set of assumptions about reality, which, for example, is bounded and finite. Next slide, please. This talk looks at an alternative approach to computing, where matter and information are entangled, agentized, is not symbolic, and does not require translation into material expressions, as it is not only physical, but also capable of making decisions. Next slide, please. Nature uses this type of computation, which was of interest to Alan Turing. His 1952 paper on morphogenesis, published 2 years before his death, asked how nature computed. He examined how patterns occur everywhere in nature, from systems from leopard spots to how petals are spiraled around a flower. And Turing decided that the mechanism of their production could be explained using mathematics and represented as an algorithm. Next slide, please. Turing's interest in the technological potential of the natural world inspired this term, natural computing, which currently consists of a range of overlapping practices that are interpreted by different disciplines, specifically morphological and unconventional computing, which include developments in material sciences, chemistry, biology, and they render accessible the actual substrates that nature uses to compute. Next slide, please. Morphological computing is a form of natural computing that arises from the fields of robotics and engineering. It's begun to exploit the shape and nonlinear properties of materials to improve the efficiency of a computation. Next slide, please. Unconventional computing is a branch of information technology that aims to enrich or go beyond the standard models of computing, such as the Turing machine and von Neumann architectures, which have dominated computing science for more than half a century. Next slide, please. These alternative computing systems are providing fresh insights into how materials at far from equilibrium states make decisions, such as in soft robotics, slime mold computing, and reaction diffusion computing. Next slide, please. Perhaps surprisingly, natural computing is generally conservative and predictable, although when a tipping point is reached, it may then behave unpredictably, where group interactions give rise to novel, emergent, complex events that are not characteristic of any of the participating agents. Next slide, please. By drawing on the agency and unique properties of lively matter, natural computing creates a convergent platform for different kinds of analog programming. For example, by organizing interfaces like logic gates, shown here by crabs, and organizing between the physical and informatic realms. So when natural computing techniques are applied to architectural challenges, they have the potential to alter the character of our living spaces. Next slide, please. Nature does not count with numbers, but engages the dynamic properties of matter, where even inert materials are never entirely still. Next slide, please. Atomic nuclei are orbited by electrons that occupy probabilistic trajectories, and each atom is influenced by the proximity of others. Our current understanding of matter is informed by quantum dynamics and chemical reactivity that we're now starting to uncover in increasing detail and even apply their principles to address specific challenges. Next slide, please. The massless specks of quantum matter carry information that can be physically exploited in the computing process to store, process, manipulate information simultaneously in ways that are not possible using the electrons in our current digital computers. These information packages or quanta use a different kind of digit for counting called a qubit and provide the units for quantum computing using quantum properties, namely superposition and entanglement. Next slide, please. So qubits can take many physical forms like atoms, ions, photons, and even individual electrons within electrical circuits. Like bits, qubits are measured using our binary system of ones and zeros, but unlike a classical bit, qubits can be both a 1 and a 0 at the same time. And what is measured depends on what the qubit's final output will be. Next slide, please. So being faster and using less energy than modern digital computers, quantum computing operates on fundamentally different principles than modern computing, which makes them really well suited to solving particular mathematical problems, such as finding very large prime numbers. Next slide, please. The real challenge, however, is whether we can imagine appropriate new uses for these capabilities, which are not just extensions of our current thinking. Next slide, please. Currently, the near using computers to model a task that our present supercomputers aren't really very good at. In July 2016, Google engineers used a quantum device to simulate a hydrogen molecule for the first time. And since then, IBM has modeled the behavior of even more complex molecules. Eventually, it's expected that quantum simulations will help design entirely different molecules and even discover what happens inside complex chemical reactions. Next slide, please. To find a platform where new kinds of computing are possible means that digital units of computation, the fingers we use to count with, must spatialize and activate information in the counting process. As a physical process, information is no longer indicative of downstream translation taking place within another apparatus, but embodies the processes of life. Next slide, please. The exchange of electrons as a computational currency complements the continual flow of electrons through matter, which is also a characteristic of life. Next slide, please. This electron exchange is different than what occurs within conductive circuits. In living systems, electrons don't all flow together like a river, but travel in pairs, and their exchanges are far more distributed than in conductive wires, enabling a never-ending web of potential permutations. And this diverse chemical carrier system is called a metabolism. which brings a dynamic animating principle to matter. Carried by the patchily distributed yet continuous flow of electrons from molecular transport systems, the loss or gain of one of these units can change the chemical properties of a molecule with different downstream effects. Next slide, please. The fundamental ability to transform substrates through information, in other words, passing electrons to an atom, establishes the conditions for responsive matter. Once a never-ending chain of electron transfer is set in motion, designed exchanges between substrates can produce material semiotic apparatuses, which Eva Hayward calls fingery eyes. Such sensuous matter queers notions of sense-making, sensual meaning, and action, which can be reproduced through materially entangled modes of digital computation. These digits are not abstractions or dissociated from the system in which they exist, but like our own fingers, can feel, sense, touch, slide into each other, as well as the surroundings, to negotiate outcomes as new kinds of haptic matter. Next slide, please. So what do such haptic informatic systems look like? As models for early cells that do not possess any DNA, dynamic droplets exhibit strikingly lifelike features, such as being able to move around their environment and interact with each other. Next slide, please. Able to spontaneously structure themselves and respond to cues in their environment, the droplets can feel their way around a petri dish. Their site-digit vivification involves the droplet body in the computational process. Semi-living interfaces, concentrations, intensities, gradients, and depositions replace the semiotics of classical computation to engender autonomous behaviors, peculiar sensitivities, and soft time-based constructions that enable multiple kinds of programmable sensual bodies that appropriately orient themselves around their environment. Next slide, please. Providing a platform for the development and testing of the theory and practice of natural computing based in material phenomena, dynamic droplets belong to a class of objects known as dissipative structures. Next slide, please. Dissipative structures or systems are forged from a paradoxical condition that gives rise to the operative agents of natural computation. Next slide, please. They spontaneously arise as manifestations of structure and flow from the tensions between overlapping fields of energy and matter, like convection currents, turbulent flow, aperiodic crystals, cyclones, hurricanes, and living organisms. Rather than being instructed by centralized systems, their trajectories are iteratively computed through countless local material interactions and highly sensitive to their context. Dissipative systems can also self-organize into more complex structural arrangements, geometries, or oscillators to become natural counting systems that are spatialized. Such processes can be visualized through time-based material systems, such as the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction shown here, and dynamic droplets. Next slide, please. Dissipative structures are also associated with a unique theory of structural change, known as dissipative adaptation, where they dynamically alter their organizational program without the need for a centralized code, with evolutionary potential to produce increasingly more ordered arrangements. More than a model visualization system for paradoxical entities, dissipative structures have the potential to shape an ecological era of design practice. Next slide, please. For protocells to be useful agents for design, their operations must be open to manipulation at the human scale. For the 2010 Venice Architecture Biennale, I designed a series of lifelike chemical systems for Philip Beasley's award-winning cybernetic installation, Hylozoic Ground. Next slide, please. Think of these as a chemical detail within a cybernetic computer. And various species of these droplets were used in this jungle-like environment that twitters and shivers as you pass through it. It's a little disconcerting, but entirely harmless. Next slide, please. Arranged in flasks, the droplets responded to the presence of carbon dioxide in your breath by changing colour and producing tiny structures about the size of your little fingernail. I think of this installation as exploring inside a giant nose, where the plastic fronds are hairs and the golden flasks are smart snot glands that can smell and taste and respond to your carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. A range of different chemical organs were developed for this installation. For example, the Liss plates that, driven by gravity, use diffusion precipitation fields to mark the presence of chemical time. Next slide, please. And others gradually built up chemical gardens, such as these Traub cell membranes, unraveling manifolds of chemical membrane inside a droplet. Next slide, please. To scale natural computing even further, the Future Venice project proposed strategic applications of dynamic droplet technology to bestow Venice's wood-pile foundations with lifelike properties in the rios and canals. Catalyzed by the droplet metabolism, pollutants, dissolved gases, and organic waste are captured as minerals that dynamically coat the submerged wood piles and become a living reef-like structure that responds to the rapidly changing surroundings. Next slide, please. Through cumulative mineral deposition, the city behaves in a lifelike way, self-healing and responding to environmental change without being technically alive. Next slide, please. How such a city might be experienced and developed is explored in my fiction book, Invisible Ecology. So here's an extract. At one time, it may have been enough to simply insert steel pins and plates to stop brickwork from sagging in Venice. But nowadays, the kind of manoeuvres needed to shape dynamic masonry requires a knowledge of cosmetic and plastic surgery. When we combine them, we discover new ways of making windows, walls, and doors. With this technique, we can make structures appear just by squeezing out new spaces. Next slide, please. Protocell and other agentized chemistries provide a means to explore the principles of designing with metabolism. What we learn from them is that metabolism itself is spatial, not only marking space, but also transforming its surroundings. In other words, a living body changes its environment and is not a neutral presence. So how do we design with that? Chemical agents are too fragile for advancing principles of biodesign. So to develop the architectural concepts further, I looked at the masters of this process, the microbes. Next slide, please. So I'm going to introduce the Living Architecture project, which is funded by the EU Horizon 2020 Future Emerging Technologies Open Programme. Our sixth partner consortium consisted of Newcastle University, University of Trento, University of the West of England, Spanish National Research Council, Explorer Biotech, and Liquid Systems Group. Next slide, please. Living Architecture is a combined utility system that houses microbes. It's made up of a bioprocessor wall about the size of a large bookcase that's suitable for installation in a kitchen or bathroom. Next slide, please. With waste, it performs useful cleaning, making usable amounts of electricity and generating a circular economy of the household. Next slide, please. The bioprocessor wall is made up of bricks. These double up as integrated building blocks where each brick is also a next generation selectively programmable bioreactor and ideal home for microbes. There are three different kinds of bricks are used in the wall: a microbial fuel cell, an algae photobioreactor, and a synthetic consortium bioprocessor. Each type supports different kinds of microbes, and together they are assembled in modularly stacking standardized building segments. Next slide, please. Each brick is fed with domestic waste in the form of urine and grey water and is sequentially configured like a cow stomach, where each bioprocessor differentially turns their feedstock into end metabolites and moves on to the next chamber where further transformations take place, and so on. Next slide, please. Each module or brick is effectively programmable, being assigned a particular task or identity, and a range of outputs can be produced by altering the microbial population and spatially sequencing the bioprocessors. So altogether, the system can be thought of as a metabolic app. Next slide, please. There are two basic types of metabolism used in living architecture. One is anaerobic, based on a technologically mediated composting process that can be harvested for bioelectricity, water, and oxygen. And as a standalone unit, it's known as a microbial fuel cell, which is a kind of battery powered by organic waste, and is made up of an anode, selected membrane, and a cathode. The hardware captures electrons from the bioelectrical activity of the biofilm that forms on the membrane to provide small amounts of usable electricity. And at the same time, the cell cleans water and produces other metabolites. The system is entirely self-powered, and its actions are coordinated by an AI, which can look at the amount of electricity produced by each brick and then regulates the inflow accordingly to optimize the system's outputs. Next slide, please. The other metabolism is photosynthesis, which is carried out by tiny green organisms or algae in a photobioreactor, which traps sunlight and carbon dioxide and is used to produce solid biomass. Now, our system is gravity-fed with a unique geometry and triple baffle system that promotes mixing. And the main challenge of this project is to bring the different systems together so their various products can be meaningfully exchanged. And we achieve this by boosting the electrical power from the microbial fuel cells by introducing oxygen into the cathode from the photobioreactors as a powerful electron acceptor. And achieving this integratability changes the very notion of waste, because the outputs of one system can be used directly by the other, generating a cyclical economy of matter powered by metabolism. Next slide, please. The final bioprocessor type that we developed is a synthetic consortium bioprocessor, which is examined in the biological flexibility of these metabolic apps. And it helps us establish just how far we can actually design metabolic reactions using synthetic biology techniques. While our modified reactions cleaned nitrous gases from the air, our indicator product was an inorganic phosphate that was reclaimed from household detergents. And inspired by the configuration of the microbial fuel cell, the synthetic bioprocessor is made up of a farm and label module separated by a selectively permeable membrane. Now, the farm system feeds the labor module with a rich supply of carbon from organisms that are designed to overproduce sugar. This sticky stuff passes through the membrane into the labor module and reaches workhorse organisms whose genes are well known. Now, the sugary-rich environment enables the design of new metabolisms, as under these conditions, with loads of sugar, a mixed population of modified microbes will form a consortium, enabling us to mix and match genetic sequences between different species in ways that just aren't possible in nature. And specifically, these metabolisms could reclaim phosphate from detergents, remove polluting nitrous gases from the air, and the ability to stitch together different metabolic building blocks between microbial species greatly increases the metabolic range for design and enables us to work with these processes at scale. But during the process, we created 2 new genes, with 1 patent granted and 1 pending. Next slide, please. We also developed a new software called Liss, which is a web-based DNA library design tool that makes gene sequencing more intuitive. Next slide, please. And throughout the project, we did the social acceptability of the technology prototypes that were exhibited in biennales and international exhibitions. So this first prototype here was a simple hack of a brick, turning it into a microbial fuel cell which brought together structure and process, and was displayed at the Building Centre in London and during the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2017. Next slide, please. We also developed structures that could simultaneously host unlike environments, such as this brick for the 4th Tallinn Architecture Biennale, also in 2017, which linked together photosynthetic and anaerobic organisms, enabling them to exchange metabolites with each other. Next slide, please. Our final brick prototype was based on this principle and contained 4 chambers separated by ceramic plates, where 100% of the phosphate could be reclaimed from the detergents introduced into the system. Next slide, please. And this diagram shows the spatial sequencing of the Living Architecture project and therefore completes the spatiality of the metabolic app. Next slide, please. And the final wall used synthetic organisms, and so it was explored in a laboratory rather than a social context. Next slide, please. Although we couldn't use the original living architecture wall in a public context owing to the presence of modified organisms, a prototype wall system was shown at the Whitechapel Gallery in collaboration with artist Cecile B. Evans as part of the Is This Tomorrow exhibition. Now, this installation is an apartment space where a screen is powered by unmodified organisms within a microbial fuel cell array that's then powering a post-human household inhabited by ghosts of the past, present and future. So from these building blocks of inhabitation, we can start to transform our abundant waste into substances that sustain us and start to reconfigure our homes, our economies and cities, so they're fit for a 21st century regenerative society where our everyday activities of daily living are transformed into world-making actions. Now, analog computing can direct natural forces within a structured platform to visualize and explore new architectural possibilities. Next slide, please. Incorporating haptic agents into this process enables the synthesis of all kinds of sensate animated agents or novel beasts. Next slide, please. Some of these material expressions can be recognized as living materials. Others become types of technology, and a very few of them will acquire the status of living things. This new embodied computing has far-reaching effects. Next slide, please. In medicine, we will not be implanting computer chips inside hearts, but will generate the pacemaker itself from within a person's cardiac tissue. Next slide, please. In the environment, we will seed organisms to make entirely new ecosystems. For example, eating plastic and turning it into usable electricity that runs through fungal root systems, which we will harvest like truffles. Next slide, please. Within architecture, new kinds of responsive environments, semi-living systems, and infrastructures will envelop us in our homes and feel our presence with their fingery eyes. Perhaps we'll extend a high five or recoil at their uncanny ability to always know what we're doing. However we regard them, ethical challenges will continue to proliferate in this post-natural context, but we cannot circumvent these difficulties, not least because we are way past the point of asking whether such beasts should exist. Next slide, please. Instead, if we are to establish mutual recognition and respect, then we must fully extend a duty of care towards them and their kin in anticipation that they will return the gesture in kind. Heralding a new beginning for 21st century nature, our world, newly haunted by these computational creatures, will once more become increasingly lively, and as the unfolding permutations provide new ways of existing, within them we may discover enchantment. Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment so that we can basically speak. So the question that I was posting in a minute ago, like before your talk, was hinting at which sort of strategies we can use, and I'm now posting this in the chat so that everybody can see that. Let me just sort of ask this question again. Which strategies can you, as in now you, Rachel, envisage to integrate into the heritage of architecture and the cutting-edge research that you're doing? So the real question is, how do these things come together? And how are you doing that in your teaching? Given that we are very much focusing on education within eCAADe, we would be very excited to hear your thoughts on this.
That's great. It's a fantastic question, and there isn't a simple answer, because I think that what's happening is that there's actually a many-layered approach. So effectively, we're kind of asking different questions at different scales. So there's a scale that's to do with the material and what kinds of materials we might use and in what context, within an architectural practice. And this certainly isn't a hegemony. This isn't really about, out with modern architecture, in with the new squishy things. This is really about convergent platforms, as you just said, finding commonalities, identifying those moments where actually we can reach these, let's say, tipping points of difference. And I have noted that there are questions about, does this live happily ever after, or can things go terribly wrong? I think human civilization doesn't really need other things to blame to go terribly wrong. I mean, this is really about care, attention, our responsibility towards, let's say, the architectures that enliven. And then I think that from this, let's say, a theory of the material, which we might attribute to new materialism, say, I think that would be the academic framework that within a teaching context we can use to critically evaluate the principles, the ethics, the responsibilities, the societies, the communities, what's included, what's not included. So I think new materialism forms a very great theoretical platform. Biodesign then comes into the practice of the material, given the framework of new materialism through which it can start to make appropriate decisions about what's included, what's excluded, and how we care for, let's say, lively matter. And are there different degrees of care? Also, are we looking at lifespans? So we start to see different questions and a kind of different framework for thinking about space and how we construct liveliness into that space. So it's not a theory of everything. It's really kind of working with questions about liveliness, thinking through metabolism. In other words, think about all the branches and how those branches might fold back onto each other. So in some ways, the circularity of the processes that we're designing. And not everything has to be biology either. I mean, if we look at people like Linnaeus, he actually gave the quality of liveliness to rocks and minerals. He said that, rocks grow, plants grow and feel, animals grow, feel and move. So he had like a sliding scale of liveliness, and one would imagine that engenders different kinds of responsibilities. And so then you've got these basic layers, and then you think about, well, then what is the equivalent of a building in this context? And I really like the word worlding, Heideggerian term that's being reappropriated by new materialism, so that when it's no longer enough just to make a structure that secondarily gets inhabited and utilities get imported, but actually what are the conditions within your site that make a sustainable world? And if we think about that from the outset, we're doing more than making a building. We could be making a building. We might actually be making a sewage plant. We might be making a forest. So the subjects of architecture start to, let's say, become more permeable to other forms, other ways of living and working. So I think this whole idea of how we engage the material with the computational. In other words, for me, computation is about it's not just about counting. It's why do we choose certain things that we count? And what are the consequences of that? Because there's actually a value in it. At the moment, we count things that are bounded, that we can model in a particular way, and we can describe in a particular way. And if we want to compute air, we have to reduce it to a set of bounded molecules and then start to think about other dynamics. So, these questions about, what is computing in the 21st century, are really at the heart of it, because it's saying, what is it that we notice? What is it that we value? What is it that we are investing our care and attention in? And for anybody who's interested in, let's say, the philosophy of computing, fantastic book by François Chatelain, a mathematician, who says that if we just have one form of computation, then we lose the philosophy of mathematics, particularly number theory. So she doesn't use real numbers at the basis of her computing. She uses irrational numbers, ones that can't be completely divided by another and go on infinitely, because she says that nature is infinite, and therefore we should be using these kinds of numbers or these kinds of relationships. So I think it's a very exciting field. I think that that in the classroom you can approach it from different levels, and I think with each class we actually have a look at different aspects of how is architecture going to enliven its sites rather than simply draining resources and at best having zero impact. So rather than trying to solve it all at once, we take ideas for a walk, use kitchen experiments that have to be very complicated, and get people engaged in actually looking at matter again, and rethinking about the relationship between form, texture, permanence, and with that comes an aesthetic. But the aesthetics is not the driver. I would say if we are going to put a value on the kinds of architectures produced, it is really, what is the legacy of that architecture from its inception? Does it make a site more fertile, livelier, a nicer place to be? So we kind of want to get away from absolutes of form and function and efficiencies of scale, and start to rethink through the parameters of liveliness and how we might reinvigorate the spaces we inhabit.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. That was almost a little lecture in itself. No, I think it's fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. We are actually moving into the next sessions. I think the co-hosts have started the sessions. We're running like a few minutes late, which is fine too. I just want to summarize. I want to say three things that I kind of realized now from your talk, and especially the summary that you gave and the further depicting on what you're talking about. Big question: what is computing in the 21st century? This is a humongous question, and I think we already answered the question: what's the difference between digital architecture and computational architecture? But we have not yet answered the question: what is computing? And maybe you don't need to answer that. Maybe it becomes an ongoing research, especially for architects. The next thing you were talking about is buildings and nicer places to live in. So the question of ecology, the question of habitats, and liveliness in all aspects becomes absolutely relevant. So thank you very much for sharing your FET project insights. This is extremely encouraging for the ones within the community who are trying to work highly interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, also two words which are a bit vague in these times. I would like to invite you, which we did already, to definitely join tomorrow the roundtable discussion in Berlin time, late afternoon. And it may well be that this roundtable discussion will take a little longer than we scheduled it in the program, because it looks as if there's plenty of things coming together, and we're very much looking forward to this. In the meantime, join the sessions, register for them. You receive passwords via email. Each session is individual. So you register for each session, you receive a password for each session, and if you're overloaded with information or need to exchange with, speakers or fellow community members, drop into the Maud Esley bar, which is the Zoom room, and it's open, and we are going to send out the link and the password to all registrants again. So in that sense, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much, everybody who listened in and watched the live stream. Keep your questions until tomorrow, and then we can see if we can discuss these things somehow online. Thanks, Rachel. Have a great afternoon in Newcastle or London or wherever you are, and we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, thank you, everyone.